This is the final regular episode of this season of Catalyst. If you missed the last episode, go back and listen. If you're caught up, here's where we left off.
When the drownings first started, a lot of locals in Austin were commenting on my videos on TikTok asking me to look into it.
I got a story about someone who encountered a very strange man around Lady Bird Lake.
And this man believes that he was targeted and drugged, but survived to tell the story.
So it's not out of the realm of possibility if someone's drunk or someone had their drink spiked and they walk a little bit off the path. I mean, you're in the body of water.
You can't control what everyone says in the comments.
And they've even named this possible killer as the Rainey Street Ripper.
And I think it's easy to spread misinformation with the current state of social media.
Police have said repeatedly for years that there is no serial killer in Lady Bird Lake.
If that's a conclusion that they're coming up with, that's one that I, would believe.
Austin, Texas is no stranger to stories about a serial killer roaming its streets. In the 1880s, as the city's population was just beginning to boom, locals grappled with a series of 8 axe murders by a perpetrator some would come to call the Servant Girl Annihilator, or the Midnight Assassin. All those attacks happened while the victims were asleep in their beds, some dragged and killed outside, some severely mutilated. It was one of the earliest documented examples of a possible serial killer operating in the U.S. Today, the cases remain unsolved. In 1991, a young woman was abducted from an Austin car wash, tortured, and murdered by serial killer Kenneth McDuff, known to some as the Broomstick Killer, for the weapon he used to choke a previous victim. McDuff was paroled a few years earlier due in part to prison overcrowding, and then went on a killing spree across Central Texas. In total, he was responsible for the deaths of at least 9 people, officials say maybe more. McDuff's crimes led to his execution and to major reforms in the state's criminal justice system. Today, most of the serial killer stories you hear in Austin surround Lady Bird Lake and the bodies found floating there. The downtown waterway's proximity to the bar district along historic Rainey Street earned the city's latest supposed serial killer the name Rainey Street Ripper. Even though, as I mentioned in a previous episode, less than a quarter of the lake's 30 drowning victims in the past decade were last seen or found near that area. To get to that number, 30, wasn't easy. Our team obtained police reports in nearly all those cases, several containing up to 70 pages of investigative detail. To fill in gaps, we scoured autopsy reports in person at the medical examiner's office, watched hours of surveillance and body camera footage, and listened to dozens of 911 audio recordings.
Austin 911, do you need police, fire, EMS?
Probably police. And I looked in the water and I think I see a dead body, floating.
To focus on drownings that could be preventable, we removed deaths by suicide from the list, as well as deaths from natural causes like heart disease as the primary factor. We also eliminated cases of people who drove into the lake or were swept away by floodwaters, along with those that happened on the shore or in nearby bodies of water. Finally, we excluded cases where the medical examiner couldn't determine the cause and manner of death. We focused instead on just drownings, mostly ruled accidents, in the decade between 2015 and 2025. Then we turned our questions to Austin police to better understand why they and other officials had made those determinations.
My name is Nathan Sexton, and I am a sergeant with the Austin Homicide Unit. I am one of the 2 supervisors of the detectives that we have in the Homicide Unit.
Why are most of the deaths assigned to the Homicide Unit initially, the ones we're talking about, even if it is eventually ruled an accident?
We need to ensure that deaths are not suspicious, that there's no foul play, so there's far more deaths that are investigated that turn out to not be homicides than that are homicides. Patrol officers will respond to a death scene in town. A homicide detective would then go to the scene to assess it and determine if there was or was not foul play.
Roughly how many drowning deaths do you think your unit has responded to in Lady Bird Lake in recent years?
I think it's about 4 or 5 a year.
What do you say to the families who believe that their loved ones' deaths in those instances weren't just accidental drownings?
All of these cases have been looked at with, obviously, rightfully so, a lot of scrutiny. We try to do as thorough an investigation as we possibly can. And every case is looked into by not only our detectives, but the medical examiner's office, their doctors, their medical examiner investigators.
When and how did you first hear about the idea of a serial killer drowning victims in Lady Bird Lake?
As long as I've been in homicide, and I started there in 2016, and this is nothing new. Being a homicide detective obviously will get pushback occasionally from families or friends that may not believe that their loved one's death was an accident. As far as I've known, there's always been talk of more to it.
What theories specifically have you heard? Like, who do people think this supposed serial killer is in Austin?
Right, that's a good question. I can't even speak to all the theories. They're wild and all over the map. I've never heard any one consistent theory as to what people think it could be. I mean, we get tips all the time that people think it could be their neighbor, their boss, or anyone, any member of the community. So they're all over the map in potentially identifying people that they think may be suspects.
There is a name that they call this person, the Rainey Street Ripper.
Right. Yes, Rainey Street Ripper, sure. Like I said, we get a lot of tips on these things, which we have to filter through and make sure that there's no validity or any evidence behind these things. And, you know, I think conspiracy theories can be very popular and exciting. A lot of these deaths don't take place in the Rainey Street area. A few of them happen to, and I think that's where the phrase was coined. But I mean, drownings happen all over Lady Bird Lake.
Every time we hear about a drowning, we also start hearing about these serial killer theories popping up again. How does that impact what and how you investigate those cases?
Well, with every drowning case, we definitely, like I mentioned earlier, want to make sure that the detective, the medical examiner's office is doing everything we can to look into any aspect of that. And I guess one of the only differences there is we already know that there's a lot of scrutiny and media attention, and the second someone is found in a body of water, it is extremely newsworthy.
How have you determined that these cases aren't connected?
I mean, other than they're found in bodies of water, there's not like, for example, there's no trauma to the body in the vast majority of these cases. There's just no commonalities. The decedents are all different. I think initially there was a push that it may be males of a certain age.
Some of the decedents investigated by Sergeant Sexton's unit in or near the lake were not men. They could be any type of death. But our analysis revealed of the victims over the last decade who autopsy reports showed definitively drowned, all of them were men. And their average age was 34, not mostly college age like many stories suggest.
So there's no one set mold for exactly who the decedents are.
Police have said for years there is no serial killer drowning victims in Lady Bird Lake. How do you determine that?
Just the evidence. I mean, there has to be evidence to show that there was some sort of foul play, that something happened to this person. We're not saying that people are not potentially being drugged out there. Like, we can't speak to that in every case. We get toxicology back, and for the vast majority of these cases, I mean, there's drugs in a lot of people's systems. We find by and large that the decedents in these cases either couldn't swim, had a mental illness issue going on at the time, were suicidal, or there was some sort of drug or alcohol content where it was an extremely impairing level. So that generally seems to be the themes that we see in most of these drownings.
If they were drugged, then that suggests that someone did that to them, possibly.
Sure.
Have there been any arrests to that nature?
Not from our unit. In our cases, even though people are pulled from the water, they still do toxicology, and we still have not found like significant levels to where it's been deemed a homicide in any of these cases.
How has talk of a serial killer made it more challenging for your unit to investigate these cases?
I think a lot of the community really buys into this and really believes that there is one, and that can be frustrating. Just like I had mentioned, I think a lot of people will then call in tips, and I think it just takes from resources that could be spent in other areas. Our victim services counselors, the families can often be misled to think that there's more to it than this, because they'll see everything else going on in the news and think there might be foul play, and that could potentially, I think that's very damaging to families, and that is definitely an obstacle to overcome when we're trying to work with them and help them through this very difficult time.
Certainly social media is more prevalent than it was a decade ago. How has social media fueled those theories and impacted your investigations?
Sure. I mean, it's just more outlets for people to view. You know, as you said, years ago, there weren't quite so many places you could go click and watch a YouTube video or TikTok or whatever it is to see somebody explaining and walking through exactly what their theories are. And there's just so many more sources for these potentially, conspiracy theories.
How do those theories take up time and resources during an investigation?
Just a lot of different tips coming in. People are concerned that it might be someone in their community, or might think that a particular crime happened that did not. And a lot of people, I think, have been misled to think that there's more to it than there really is.
Some social media influencers suggest that people are turning to them for answers because police might not be transparent enough and might have lost the trust of the public. How do you respond to that?
We try to be as transparent as possible. We get requests all the time for information on these drowning cases. They're released through our public information office. There's nothing to hide. We're very happy to, explain every part of what we can to hopefully assure the community that in a city this big, unfortunately, the nature of it is there's going to be drownings. People are going to die in the water. For the integrity of the investigation, we have to wait until all toxicology and the autopsy report comes back, which can take 3 to 4 months for the case to be fully closed out to release that. So it's not like we're trying to hide anything. We just have to wait for that to be closed.
How does the prevalence of social media pop up with these drownings compared to those other cases?
There's just not as much interest in the other homicides. It's kind of wild. There's actual homicides that people don't seem to be as interested in, but it's not part of a bigger or more interesting conspiracy theory. So I think that there's, just the popularity of it, the momentum that it has, it just lends itself to be a completely different event.
Why has APD decided to partner with academic researchers at Texas State University to look closer at these drownings?
They approached us just asking if we can answer some questions for them. We were happy to do that. As I mentioned earlier, we try to be as transparent as we possibly can. We would gladly share that data and hope that it helps people get a better picture and understand what's truly going on, and hopefully data to back up what we've been trying to say for years may help.
That meant sharing case details with researchers, many of the same records we'd reviewed. So I spoke with the man leading the team behind that study to learn more about his expertise and why police and the public could trust his findings.
I'm Kim Rossmo. I'm professor in the School of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Texas State University. I'm also the director of the Center for Geospatial Intelligence and Investigation.
What is that?
It is a center within the university where we do research for law enforcement, intelligence, military projects, where we try to use the locations and times of events to determine what information or intelligence can be derived from them to improve public safety.
And how long have you been at Texas State?
I've been there 22 years. I'm originally from Canada. I spent over 20 years as a police officer in Vancouver, Canada, in British Columbia. I was a detective inspector. I was in charge of our geographic profiling section, which did a lot of work on serial crime, including serial murder. And as a criminologist, I studied the target patterns of serial murders. That got me involved in a number of operational cases. I probably worked close to 40 operational cases assisting police agencies and investigators looking at serial murder, and I've probably studied another 50 to 70 in some detail. And that's one of the reasons I thought this would be a worthwhile project, that we could take a look at location patterns, time patterns, what we know about serial murder, and see what could we determine from the actual evidence about these drownings to see, do we have a serial killer?
The cases that you worked on when you were a police officer and later a researcher in Canada, what were some of the more notable ones?
Well, probably the one that was the most infamous was the pig farm serial killer in the suburbs of Vancouver, a man by the name of Willie Picton. And one of the interesting things about that particular case was the fact that women were disappearing. We didn't know what that meant. In fact, at that point, it was called the Missing Women Investigation. So you had a street sex trade worker that would normally show up at a certain corner, certain days of the week, and then they just disappear. And it reached a point that there were a few dozen of these. So some people believe they had just moved. You know, the Skid Row lifestyle where they operated tends to be somewhat nomadic. There was a big debate about what this meant. Were these women victims of a serial killer? Were they just moving on somewhere else? Did they go home? And so I ended up doing an analysis which was met with a fair bit of pushback because I thought there was a serial killer. One of the key things we did was we borrowed techniques from epidemiology, something called spatial temporal clustering, which simply means, do we have too much happening in too small an area in too short a time period for the just to be random? Because we always get ups and downs. So if I could, again, borrow an example from what the CDC might do, we have an outbreak of tuberculosis in San Antonio. Well, we're going to have a certain number of cases. What's the average? What's normal? What's our base rate? And then if all of a sudden we have too many disease reports in a certain area, and it's too small an area and it's too short a time period, well, we have to ask why. It could be an epidemic. And so that's the approach we took. We went back 20 years. I got data on unfound missing women from that area. And it ended up being only 0, sometimes 1, at the most 2, until we got to the point, I think it was maybe 95, and now the number started to jump up significantly. It was statistically significant. And the only explanation I could think of was a serial killer, because it only happened to women, not men. No bodies were being found. And this wasn't happening elsewhere, like in other Western Canadian cities. And so that analysis ended up, unfortunately, being correct, that they were victims of this person who admitted to killing 49 women and burying them out on his pig farm. So there was a case of what has been called linkage blindness, where police departments don't see or sometimes refuse to see linkages between cases. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. We need to remember that serial murder is incredibly rare. We need to recognize that there's huge resource demands if you do recognize you have a serial killer case. And so there are scientific techniques, statistical techniques we can use to try to determine if something like that is happening. And so that was the approach here with the drownings in the so-called Rainey Street district, the Lady Bird Lake area, Colorado River. Let's look at the data. Let's look at the numbers. Let's take a look at patterns over time, and let's see what they tell us without any sort of preconceived bias. And when I did this, when I talked to APD about it, they committed to releasing the results publicly, and let's tell the public what we found, and then we will respond accordingly. The last thing you want to do is ignore a serious problem like this, but you also don't want to put resources, especially with limited budgets, into something that's not there. Policing is a very large part of any city budget, so let's be effective and efficient, and let's use knowledge, research, and data to determine where our problems are and what they are, and then maybe what we can do about them. So I just thought, well, what are the actual numbers? What is it on a yearly basis? How has this changed over time? What are the exact locations? What does the actual data say? An unbiased, objective, scientific analysis. We talk about linkage analysis, which is linking crimes together. We talk about spatial and temporal patterns, which are critical to what we have here. The typical homicide, there's going to be body, DNA, fingerprints, maybe, a gun. Police can analyze that physical evidence. But sometimes we don't have that. We might just have a location and a time. So that is a clue. So with one case, you get some information. But if you have a series of cases, you got patterns. And by weaving those together, you can use those patterns to help determine what has happened. And then that leads us into cluster analysis, which is the main approach we use. We're looking for clusters or spikes of things in time and space that might suggest we have a serial offender.
APD has consistently said that they don't suspect any foul play, that there's not a serial killer here. Is this study a way to solidify that message?
This was not meant to be supporting them or be critical of them. It's just meant to say, what can we figure out from this evidence without sort of having a predetermined goal in mind?
Dr. Rossmo used a data tactic he pioneered called geographic profiling, and his method for narrowing the numbers wasn't that different from ours.
So we wanted to be very comprehensive and thorough. And that data, which included locations, latitude and longitude, dates for when the bodies were recovered, and other key characteristics, sex, age, general circumstances. From that, we removed some that were obviously not of our interest. So, for example, a flooding death. Unfortunately, as we know from recent events, flooding is not uncommon in this part of Texas. We removed boat accidents or things where it clearly were suicide. So we wanted, if we put in too much noise, we won't be able to determine the patterns. But if we are too exclusive, we may miss key things. So we tried to find an optimal balance and analyze that information.
So essentially, the number that you whittled it down to are people that truly died because of a drowning and their body was found in the lake.
These are the cases that match the MO and the victimology of the Rainey Street Ripper, if he or she exists.
Lady Bird Lake is actually part of a chain of reservoirs along the lower Colorado River. Its 5-mile stretch cuts through downtown Austin and right by Rainey Street. But the lake extends much farther on either end, so like our team, Dr. Rossmo's researchers looked at its entirety.
For our target group, which are the cases we think fit the modus operandi and the victimology of the alleged Rainey Street serial killer, we focused on a geography extending from Red Bud Isle on the west end of downtown Austin to 183 on the east end.
So it was essentially drowning deaths in this stretch of the Colorado River, which includes Lady Bird Lake.
Yes.
But to apply his full comparative analysis, Dr. Rossmo expanded the most recent decade where we'd focused to the last 22 years, roughly doubling the time frame and also the number of drowning cases.
And then ended up with about 58. And that's over 22 years.
Why that time stretch?
Well, again, we need to know what is normal. What is an aberration? What is a jump or a spike suggesting that we have some outside influence at play? This is what we did with the missing women. Just determine what was the normal number of missing women over time. And then we found this spike beginning in 95 and then just getting higher over the next 3-4 years.
So from that 58, how do you determine if there is the likelihood of a serial killer or not?
So we take a look again for these jumps. How is this anything different from what we've seen as a normal pattern or the base rate?
His team's conclusion, there's likely no serial killer drowning people in Lady Bird Lake.
Do you feel like the results are going to convince people, finally, there is no serial killer?
I think they'll convince some people. Others, the research is very clear that once people make up their minds, some of them can be very, very difficult to budge from that, especially some of the more vocal people on social media. We need to remember social media is driven by clicks and algorithms that stress sensationalized stories. So I don't think you can do anything about that, but hopefully this will allow for a more moderate and rational discussion. And then a related issue is if these drownings are the product of something other than serial murder, what about that? Can you do more? There are reports we found that say Texas as a whole has higher than average drowning risk rate. And that's something maybe to think about, trying to figure out how to make this less likely to happen. One of the issues obviously is alcohol and proximity of bars and nightclubs to water areas. There's a study that showed something like 78% of all drownings in Texas are males. So men are bigger risk takers than women. So I think that is, in our data, we found more men than women. Now it's been suggested, well, that's the serial killer's preference, that he's going after young men. Well, how does this differ, if at all, from what we find from drownings across the entire state of Texas going back many years? It's just the victimology is different because men engage in probably more drinking and riskier behavior. It all comes down to an understanding of what's really happening, not a story based on that.
How do you think that this study might help set the record straight?
I think just having actual facts, research to kind of demonstrate a bigger picture and a better understanding of that there's just not any factual evidence to support that there's a killer. There is no serial killer, that the unfortunate deaths that happen for a city this size are consistent with a population this size and a body of water that runs right down the middle of it.
Our team wanted to know if Sergeant Sexton's statement stacked up. So we looked at medical examiner and law enforcement data in other U.S. cities with populations roughly the same size as Austin. They also have waterways in their downtowns and along their entertainment districts like Rainey Street here. We used the same criteria we applied to Austin's deaths, though some cities were difficult to determine because they don't track drownings or the details surrounding them so easily. Still, those we could compare had far fewer than Austin's total over the last decade. Columbus, Ohio had just 6, Fort Worth had 14, and both also had fewer drownings related to alcohol.
Talk to me about the elevated levels of alcohol that we've seen in several of the cases. We've seen autopsy and toxicology reports, and know that several have been last seen in the Rainey Street bar district, sometimes caught on video drinking.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, no surprise, people drink an excessive amount, you can become impaired. Some people, whether attempting to use the bathroom or just go down by the river just to see it, that close access can be dangerous. Mixing, whether it's drugs or alcohol, with a body of water nearby, there's potential, obviously, for drownings.
People continue calling for cameras on the Rainey Street district and along the lake as a police resource. Where does that stand?
I can't speak to that. That's not, it's beyond our purview in the homicide unit, but obviously any death investigation that we conduct is always aided by video surveillance.
Speaking of cameras, and people making calls for that type of thing, I've watched city council archive video of some of the families. Mitchell Gutierrez, whose brother Martin died in 2018, speaking directly with city council because he wanted more done. What do you think as the law enforcement officer who responds to these cases when you see a family member making that desperate plea?
Yeah, it's very sad. And, we try to work with the families as much as we possibly can and explain to them everything that is involved in that case. And we want to have that open communication. We have victim services counselors that can help talk them through the process as well. But we try to explain as much as we can of the findings that we have. And if there's just no evidence to support that this was a homicide, that's what the evidence supports. And there's only so much that we can do in those instances. So we obviously sympathize with the families, and it's very difficult to lose a loved one in any circumstance. So we just try to keep that communication as open as possible.
When their plea is about implementing solutions to stop future drownings, what do you think about that?
That's a tough challenge to overcome, right? I mean, you have a handful of drownings every year throughout a gigantic body of water in a huge city. Like, how do you stop that? That's, a large challenge for anyone to try to overcome. I don't know that you can.
La Crosse, Wisconsin has for years had their police department partnering with college students who were volunteers to do what they call Operation River Watch. And so on Thursday, Friday, Saturday night in their bar district, which is right next to the park where many of these drownings have happened, and the volunteers go out and patrol. What do you think when you hear about a community that has implemented a solution that they have found has actually diverted people away from going in the water?
Sure. Especially, I think that would, the potential for success there if there's like a smaller, narrower entry point. For our situation, it's such a huge body of water. And I'm sure it would help, but for there to be so many different entry points, it would be difficult resource-wise to man and watch that much area of that big of a river.
What is the likelihood that APD could patrol more around the lake and the trail? What's stopping officers from doing more of that?
That's one I probably can't speak to. I know resource-wise, we're still very undermanned and still trying to get just enough officers out there on the streets to actually be able to take calls. I think anything where you have people volunteering or willing to provide resources to have some sort of visibility, I'm sure would not hurt.
Do you think that Austin or police would be willing to look at that if university volunteers were willing to do something like that here?
I'm sure, again, beyond our homicide unit, but I know our department would I'm sure we would be happy to entertain any sort of volunteers that wanted to assist in visibility.
After Dr. Rossmo's team published its study last year, Austin's police chief issued a statement saying, in part, the agency will continue to work with the city and community partners to reduce risks associated with drowning, particularly in areas with high foot traffic near water. City leaders have not yet said how the results of the study might inform their future decisions, but remember Councilman Zoe Caudry told us he would speak to the city manager about more lighting and cameras, along with exploring the possibilities of a volunteer patrol along the water. We'll follow up with any developments. To learn more about Austin's Lady Bird Lake drownings, watch our docuseries and explore our digital investigation online now at kxan.com/beneath the surface. Catalyst is reported and produced by me, Josh Hinkle, along with David Barrere, Arzo Dost, and Dalton Huey. Our editor is Richie Bose. Digital support comes from Robert Sims and Kate Winkle. KXAN's news director is Haley Syhawk, and its general manager is Eric Glassberg.